Hey guys, in today's video, you are baking with Rebecca. I ended up making homemade bread for what most people would consider Thanksgiving, but because my family is part Native American, we do not celebrate regular Thanksgiving. We also don't eat ham or turkey on Thanksgiving either. We usually do like a roast or chicken. So the chicken that I ordered ended up being out of stock, so I ended up getting chicken thighs, and I made do. This is a recipe that I've had for probably 20 years. It's made so you can put it in a bread machine, but I make it without the bread machine. This yeast that I'm using I think is old, and you'll find out why later. But this is a super easy lactose-free bread recipe. There is butter involved, but you can substitute that for milk-free butter. I use like the sweet cream butter from like Walmart or Land O'Lakes, whatever. And I use the salted version, not the unsalted version. This recipe calls for 3/4 of a cup of water and then like 2 tablespoons. I usually do almost a full cup when I'm doing it by hand. It takes 2.5 cups of bread flour and 1 teaspoon of sugar, which I usually add into my yeast mixture. 3/4 of a teaspoon of salt. You can do a whole teaspoon if you want. I just kind of measure it out just in a teaspoon and do it by eye. And then 1.5 tablespoons of butter, depending on how you want to make it. I usually just kind of throw in 2 pats of butter, which is roughly 2 tablespoons, and then 3 tablespoons of active dry yeast, which I think is 2 packets if you use the packets versus buying like the jar. The jar, I find I get like 3, maybe 4 loaves of bread out of a jar, and that's it. I use lukewarm water if it's almost skin temperature is about where I leave it temperature wise. I put hot water in a measuring cup and then let it sit on the counter while I measure everything else out. I put all of my dry ingredients in the mixture first, and the reason why I had to mute the sound on this was my dad ended up waking up while I was in the middle of doing this, and he came out in the kitchen and he was making coffee and doing cat boxes and that kind of stuff, and he ended up like farting super loudly. So if you look at one point, I'm like dying laughing. So he's like, "Oh my God, you're not recording audio, are you?" And I'm like, yeah, I am." He's like, "Shit. Well, and he got really embarrassed. I was like, "I can mute the sound out. Don't worry about it." This batch ended up being bad anyways. It was flat, to say the least. It ended up being very not rising. And I used, regular flour. You can use bread flour with it. But I find bread flour gets really like doughy to the texture. It's harder to work with. I also added olive oil in on this when I first started working with it. And normally I don't work with bread with fingernail polish on, because you can potentially get fingernail polish into the mix, but I'm super careful with how I do things and how clean things are. The counter in between each time I put anything on it got sprayed down with Clorox cleanup and then wiped, and then a rag with regular clear water was run over that. So I'm like super anal about how clean things are, and I always clean as I go. So this was the first batch. Put a little bit of olive oil in there, and because it was kind of chilly in the house, I ended up getting a cheesecloth wet, and then I stuck it outside on one of the ladders outside so that it could sit in the sun to rise. And that's where we're at right now. And then I've got my rag there to wipe everything down and put all my dishes up. This is super easy. It takes usually about 2 hours for it to rise well enough before you beat it down. And then you beat it down and let it rise again. There's the Clorox. I'm super anal about how clean things are, especially in my kitchen when I'm cooking. When you let it like rise, you rise until it doubles in size. And then you beat it down, you dump it out, you beat it down, you work it a little bit, you put it back in the bowl, and then you let it rise again till it's double in size. Once it's doubled in size for the second time, you take it out, you beat it down, you massage it, you knead it, you do what you're supposed to do with bread, right? Okay, I'm trying this again because the bread that's been rising for about 4 hours hasn't really done anything. So I'm going to make a new batch. I found a new thing of yeast. So I'm going to try and make another batch, and hopefully it'll be ready when it comes time for dinner. Flour, and then it's like 3/4 of a teaspoon of salt. So I don't get out the 1/4 and the 1/2 or whatever. I just kind of eyeball it. And you want your water warm but not too hot. Now I add a teaspoon of sugar in the mix, and then in here, which is where the yeast goes, I do a 1/2 tablespoon is 2 teaspoons. So I add the sugar usually to the water here, and then I pour the yeast in, or I put the yeast in and then I do the water. Brand new jar of yeast, 3 tablespoons of yeast. And I kind of do rounded tablespoons. I think the other yeast I was using wasn't quite, it was either too old or whatever. Now in here, I usually flatten this out and then mix the dry ingredients. I just kind of use a coffee cup. This is between 2.5 teaspoons to 3 teaspoons of butter. So it's regular salted butter, which is why I don't put in any more salt in the bread than I did. And then I take a whisk after this sits for a second, and then I stir this because you want all the boobly stuff on it. Now I put the other one outside with a cheesecloth over it to help it rise. The cheesecloth was wet. I do not have, like, I used to work in a bakery and we had a proofing oven that we used to put our breads in, which is kind of like a steam oven. It is like setting your oven at 200 and then turning it off and then leaving the door open and putting your bread in there to rise. It's the same concept, except for there's a little bit of a moisture factor to a proofer. We also used it for donuts and whatnot. But adding the sugar to the water and yeast mixture also helps feed the yeast. And when it starts to stink like beer, you know it's about right. Now this is technically made to also go in a bread machine. You would use a little bit less water if you were using a machine. We have a bread machine. I don't use it. Again, I used to work at a bakery, so I do a lot of stuff by hand. And here goes the butter. Now I keep my workspace cleared, and then you just kind of stow it. Move this stuff off. Trying to get it so you guys can see what I'm doing. You want to make sure that the little granules at the bottom and stuff get mixed in. I usually squash everything down to kind of pick it up so that they get enough moisture on them so that they can stick to the other stuff before I throw it on the counter and mix it all together. Now, sometimes they suggest that when you start dough that you don't handle it until it's risen for the first time. It doesn't really matter. Depends on what kind of bread you're making. Some breads you don't want to like rise a whole lot. Some breads you want to rise a lot. So it depends on also the ingredients, the type of bread that you're using, and I still need a little bit of moisture in the bottom. So I'll take this and get a little bit more water. And that's maybe a teaspoon, if that, just to add some moisture to the bottom. And you can add, recommended it's like add a tablespoon of water as needed. And the water amount is supposed to be 3/4 of a cup, but I've always used like between 3/4 and a cup. And then you add like tablespoons of water as you need it. And I need a little bit more over on this side. You don't want it too wet, but you also don't want it in a crumbly little Play-Doh looking pieces. Especially not when you go to dump it out on your workstation. Now I usually add oil to mine. I have olive oil sitting on the counter. I'm not going to oil this batch. Sometimes bread does not like to be oiled until after it's risen once. Now these little chunky pieces you kind of have to hand manipulate in to get everything all squashed together. And the counters and everything have been sanitized before I even started working. Same with my hands. I never touch anything in the kitchen without sanitizing stuff. I'm super freaky about all that stuff. I'll bleach everything from the ceiling to the floor before I even think about messing with anything. This dough's a little wet, which might be beneficial to it. Now, you could do one of two things and like flour it so it's not as doughy. But I think the moisture might actually help it. And it's hot outside right now, so it'll be better to leave it a little wet so it can rise a little better. Just pick up dough pieces off the counter. You get them off of me too. And then I'm gonna put it in here, and I'm gonna get another cheesecloth, get it wet, cover it, and I'm gonna go set this out where the sun can hit it and warm it up. And hopefully there's enough moisture in here and between that and the cheesecloth that it'll hopefully rise, seeing as that's a brand new jar. I just opened it. The one in the fridge I've had open since like Father's Day, but I don't know, maybe the yeast was old, who knows. Anyways, I'll come back when it's risen and play with it for the next part. Because I recorded too far and I'm actually at the batch that I made the second time, I'm going to use this audio clip for, you know, where I'm actually beating it down. So you let it rise, you beat it down, you let it rise again, you beat it down, you let it rise a third time. And then that's when you beat it down and you separate it usually into whatever loaf size that you want. And that is usually what I recommend. Once you beat it down the second time, you can separate it and then put it on your baking tray and do what you want to there. And then let it, usually while the oven is preheating, I set it on the stove so that the heat from the oven can help it rise a little bit faster. If you need to rise your dough and you're in a colder climate or your house isn't very warm, put your oven on the lowest temperature setting, which is about 200. Put it on so it says it preheated, and then turn it off. Open the oven. Put a glass or a bowl of something that's heat safe in the oven. And then you can slide your bowl into the oven, but leave the door open so that the hot air can go out past it, and that will also help your bread rise a little bit faster. When I was 18 and 19, I was working part-time at a bakery and then part-time at a salon. Well, actually, it was full-time both places, to be honest. It ended up being like 40 hours both places. But I've learned a lot from the baker that I used to work for, and the bakery is no longer there anymore. The guy who used to own the bakery and the restaurant next door did some really shady business dealings, And so I'm not quite sure what all happened to him. I haven't really looked it up because I'm really not that interested. But the bakery ended up closing down, and the head baker went back to a very well-known bakery in the area, which is the Yalaha Bakery. A lot of people know where that's at that are from Central Florida, and there are people that travel 50 to 100 miles just to get their breads there. So this guy, this is a recipe that he gave me back when I was like 18, 19, and I've used it ever since, and I've never had any problems with it. This, again, is made for a bread machine. So you can use it for a bread machine. Just use less water and less butter if you're going to do it in a bread machine. And then, you just kind of put all your ingredients in, and then put your yeast and water in on top, and then just start it for dough, or start your bread machine like you normally would, and then just let it run. At the very end, I don't know if in this section I talk about heat and all that kind of stuff. You want it, your oven temperature at 375 degrees, and that's Fahrenheit, and you cook it to 45 minutes to an hour. What you want to do is when you pop open the oven, you tap on the bread, and if it goes tunk, it makes this like weird hollow thump sound. The outside of it will be crisp. The inside of it should be nice and soft. But you want to like tap the bread. And if you tap it and it's like hard to the touch in the oven, of course it's going to be hot. So you're not going to leave your hand on it for very long. You're just going to literally just kind of thump it and then take your hand out. So do that. You should, if you have a good sense of smell like I do, I bake my breads by smell. When I smell fresh bread through the house, I know it's got like 10 minutes left, and then I know to get up and go check on it. I don't usually set timers for anything that I cook because, again, I have a nose and it works super well. But again, 35 minutes to an hour at 375, and then you should be good to go. And hopefully this is helpful. All right, it's been a little over 2 hours since I started this one, and this is the one I started first, but it hasn't risen very well, so I think the yeast is old. So we're going to play with this one first. I already have one tray of chicken in the oven. One down. Gimme. Thank you. Now these will go in the oven. I've got it set for 375. It takes about 45 minutes to maybe an hour total in the oven. I usually just use my nose, but that's how I bake. I can always tell when the bread is about ready. You can tell by looking at it if it's nearly ready. And this is way too moist. It's like sticking to my clean counter. If you have issues with this, you can either scrape it off the counter like I'm doing, or you can throw some more flour down. I'm not going to worry about it because it's going to go over here on the tray. Scrape everything up into it. And I'm constantly cleaning the counters in between. Now I'm stuck to it. Okay, flour it is. You're just a little too moist for my flavoring. You can probably hear Dad out there running his drill. He's putting up a wall out back. I will let these rise a little bit more on the stovetop with the heat from the oven escaping up through the top, just for a little while after I get these, after I stop fighting with it. It's a little bit easier to maneuver. And I'll do a voiceover for the first part. I'm gonna leave in this one, and then I will just speed that up. That and Dad didn't realize I was recording and came out in the kitchen this morning, so. Now with these, sometimes people like cut them. I'm gonna cut them just a little bit, not a whole lot. You guys can't even see what the hell I'm doing. You want to go down a good 1/4 of an inch of the way down if you want any noticeable marks. This one's fat. Now to let them rise on the oven, and then I will toss them in. And I might do some video while it's in the oven, who knows. Because I forgot to record like the end of like the bread baking and me taking it out and that kind of thing, I threw in some pictures. And because I talked too long in the other clip, I ended up having to move a couple of those pictures forward, and then and the last of them were here. And then this was the entire spread. This was everything. You can kind of see me, and my lovely Santa shirt. That's like my favorite Santa shirt. I bought it when I was in my 20s, and it's like the best thing. It says, "Oh yeah, Santa thinks you've been real good this year," and he's like crapping down somebody's chimney. It's an awesome t-shirt. Anyways, this is it. That is the spread that we did. There's chicken and sausage with bacon and seasoning off to the far right. The bread is next to that. There is corn on the cob and smashed taters, which I did record a video for that as well. I throw in like everything but the kitchen sink when I make my mashed potatoes. There is jellied cranberry sauce, the butter, sour cream, basically everything you would need for a little bit of everything. The only thing I forgot was the broccoli. So that was the entire spread, and you get to watch my dad and I dish up our plates. And I also turned the chicken juice into gravy. Here I am fixing to cut into the bread. The loaf that I'm fixing to cut is that's the first loaf versus that one that actually rose. That's the second loaf that I made. The first one was definitely a dud. It didn't rise very well. It's very dense. I mean, the flavor is still good on it. That's, and the flavor from the chicken cooking with all the spices that I put on that ended up flavoring the bread as it baked in the oven with the chicken. So that was kind of a nice thing. And there is the dense loaf. I mean, it's still good bread, so it's just didn't rise very good. All right, I'm eating pieces off of it. See, that's why I don't sit and eat a whole meal. When I cook, I end up eating the entire time I'm cooking. So, anyways, I'm going to go ahead and end this here. Hopefully you guys enjoyed watching me make bread. I do love to bake. I love, cooking, period. I think I'm rather good at it. I very rarely, if ever, burn anything. And I had to go call my dad several times to come in, and the potatoes are very, very messy. There's cheese in them. So, yeah, let me know what you guys think. Like I said in many videos before, I'm more than just makeup. I like to cook and craft and crochet and sew and paint and sing, and I'm really horrible at dancing, so I don't do that. Even though I've won awards for dancing before, I still think I'm clunky and uncoordinated, so I don't really dance. But yeah, I'm more than just makeup. I enjoy a lot of things, and so Anyways, hopefully you guys enjoyed this. I will do the mashed potatoes video probably next. I'll probably edit that next. But yeah, let me know what you guys think down below. Hopefully you learned something. I will leave the recipe typed out down below. I mean, it's not my recipe. It's one that was given to me. I've had it for ages. So I will leave all the pertinent information down below. And yeah, I will see you guys later. Bye.